thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage. You know, I do a lot of neat projects here and I do a lot of stuff, build a lot of cool things, but there's one thing I don't talk much about and people ask me a lot about: the tools I use and the equipment I use. And I kind of take it for granted because when you use something every day, you don't really pay attention to it. But I recently had to do some maintenance work to my blast cabinet. And as I was working on it, I figured I'd answer some questions that a lot of folks had about blast cabinets and what media to use. Okay, so I think I've used every type of blast cabinet or blast type that there is. I've used small blast cabinets that are really small that use superfine powder for blasting aerospace parts to put a superfine finish on them. I've used benchtop size blasters, which is what I have, which I'll show you. Benchtop size blasters for car parts up to like an intake manifold size. I've used very large floor standing units that are big enough to put a fender in. Blast a whole fender or soda blast a fender. And I've used huge blasting units that you use outside. And these are giant blasting compressors that are run by gas engines, like Ingersoll Rand makes this giant compressor with a hose and a siphon, and that hose is like 2 inches in diameter, this huge high pressure line with this giant ceramic nozzle on it. And the hose, the vacuum hose, goes back to a pile of media that you're constantly sucking this media from. And I've used it to blast huge things outside, like bulldozers and dump trucks and all kinds of equipment, and you're completely covered and you're blasting away, peeling off everything off of these things. So I've used all kinds of blast equipment, so to speak, and I've also used all kinds of blast media. Now before we go look at this cabinet, there's one thing I want to say. There's kind of a misconception here when someone says sandblasting. You could go down to your local big box store, the hardware store, and buy a bag of play sand and dump it in your blaster and sandblast. You could do that. It's pretty cheap. Play sand is pretty cheap. It's probably, I don't know, $5 for a 20-50 pound bag. But there's one thing to be careful about. Sand has silica in it. And when you blast with silica, it's going to create that dust and you're going to breathe that silica in, and it's really not good for your lungs. So sandblasting really doesn't really go on as much, or you shouldn't do it at all, really. Instead, you use a blast media, and we'll talk about blast media in a little bit. But when you say sandblasting, I want to get something sandblasted, what you're saying, you want to get it blasted, and the blast media is selected by what you're blasting, what you're trying to take off, what the substrate is, and how delicate you have to be. Let's go look at this blast cabinet. I'll show you some of the modifications I did to mine to make it easier to use, and some of the things that I keep on hand so you don't have a problem when you're blasting. You're like, oh my god, I can't blast anymore, and you got to stop. Let's go take a look at that. So this is the blast cabinet I use. I bought it online. The company I think is called D-Blast, and I made a lot of modification to this. First of all, you're going to have a lot of the top. This is a plastic top. You can get them with glass tops. You can get them top load. They can be side load with a clamp with a door on the side, so you put a big part in the side. But this is big enough for, like I said, an intake manifold. One thing I recommend is you always use these plastic covers. These plastic covers have this tape on them, and you put this on the inside of the top so that as you're blasting, you etch the plastic sheet instead of your top. You don't want to keep changing plastic tops, although I do have to change tops from time to time. So that's one of the things you want to make sure you have on hand. The other thing I just had to do is I had to change the gloves, because these gloves do wear out. And this time I'm just going to try these $25 gloves from Harbor Freight. The reason I like these is because they have this fabric up in front, which makes them a lot more flexible. I had the solid rubber ones, and they seem to be very stiff. These are a lot more flexible. The other thing, the light on the inside. I changed the light that was in here. It had a fluorescent light. I changed this to a, let me shut this off here. I'll shut this. I'm getting ready to clean this and change it. But I changed this light on the inside to a regular incandescent bulb. When you have a glass bulb in there, as you're sandblasting, it's going to wear away at this light bulb and it's going to break. And I had the fluorescent, tried the fluorescent ones. I had a plastic cover over it there, but these seem to work the best. At least that's my experience. The other modification I made in the top corner, I have a big PVC pipe that I put inside and put silicone around it just to seal it, and I run that down to the bottom for my vacuum, so I'm always sucking off the top. The sucking off all the dust off the top of when I'm sandblasting. And my air supply. I use a nice 1-inch heavy braided heavy-duty air line that comes in solid. This air line goes back to my compressor before, or I'm sorry, it's after the dryer, so I have nice, clean, dry air coming into my compressor. So when I turn it on, I got the valve here that locks the door, locks the top down and turns the air on, and I have a nice, clean supply of air. That helps out a lot. Now underneath the blaster, I keep my vacuum right underneath here, and I pipe that right into the PVC pipe that goes up to the top. And I have an outlet that I wired right into the cabinet itself, so that when I turn on my cabinet, the light, it automatically turns on my vacuum on the bottom. That just makes it a lot easier, so you don't have to keep bending over, turning your vacuum on and off. The power cable just runs right up to the power supply, and that works out great. Right now my cabinet is full of the crushed glass. This is a 4070 crushed glass, and you can see it's just pretty fine, and it looks like sand, but it's not. It's actually crushed glass. I buy this from a company called Hillcrest, which is in Attica, New York. It's not too far from me, and I go pick it up right from the manufacturer, and it's only like 10 bucks for a 50-pound bag, and it works awesome. This stuff is great to crush glass. Now the other thing is, on the bottom you should have a screen here. The screen is like a filter, so big chunks don't get down into the blaster and get sucked up. And the other thing I did is I screwed mine down. I screwed this filter down all the way around, because as you're sandblasting, this thing's going to heat up and it's going to start to warp up, and it can be really aggravating. Here's my blast. Here's the blast gun itself, and I've been using this one for quite a while. And the tip is not too bad, but that tip does wear out. So you want to have spare tips on hand, because once this thing starts to go, all of a sudden it won't blast correctly, it won't have a vacuum there, and then you'll get really frustrated because you'll have to stop because your tip is worn out and you have to get a new tip. Along with keeping spare tips handy, I keep those on hand. I also have an extra bag of media I keep underneath, and some different media in case I'm blasting something different. And the glass, as you're blasting, the glass is going to get crushed down into a dust, and it gets sucked up into the vacuum, and you got to empty it out. So you consume the media as you're blasting, and as you consume it, you got to refill it. So it's nice to have some on hand where you don't have to stop and run out and get more. Now when you talk about blast media types, there are many, many different types. And I'm just going to go over some of the basic types that you might use and when to use them. Media, you choose media based on what you're blasting, the surface, the substrate, and what you're trying to remove or what you're trying to accomplish. For example, aluminum oxide is the most common blast media. It's an angular shaped media, which means if you were to look at one of the particles, it would be all kinds of angles, sharper angles, which makes it slightly aggressive. Since it's aggressive, it's sharp and it's long lasting, and you can use it for most surfaces. But remember, when you're blasting with a blast media, whatever you're hitting with that media is going to heat up. So if you're blasting a piece of sheet metal like a door or fender or something like that, and you heat it up, you're going to heat up a spot and you can warp the panel pretty easy. Not only that, you're kind of work hardening the surface and it's going to cause it to bow. So be very, very careful when you do thin sheet metal with that kind of media. But aluminum oxide, again, angular, you can use it over and over. You can pull it back out of your vacuum source, clean it out, sift through it and put it back in and use it many times. The next type is crushed glass, and that's what I have in my blast cabinet right now. This is an aggressive material. It's slightly more aggressive because it's glass and it's sharp. You would have broken glass, you'd figure it'd be sharp. So it's used more for profiling and removing coatings. Profiling meaning if you have a metal and you want to break burrs, if you want to put a profile on the surface because you're going to powder coat or you're going to put something on there, it's going to produce a little rougher surface because of the type of media that it is. It's angular, just like the silicone. I'm sorry, the aluminum oxide. It's got the same kind of angular shape, and it's going to break up, but the glass bead is consumable, meaning as it breaks up and crushes down, it gets consumed. It turns into a real fine powder dust. So you're going to use it up more than the aluminum oxide would. Now, the great thing about crushed glass is it contains no free silica. So it's very, very safe for you. It's very safe for the environment. When you got to get rid of it, it's just crushed glass. You can put it back in your garden, use it for drainage, whatever. It's that kind of material. It's almost like sand. This is the kind of stuff I use when I'm prepping something for paint or powder coating. I want to have a surface that's rough and it's ready to accept, and the material can grip into what I'm blasting. Now the next thing are glass beads. Glass beads are really cool because they're glass beads. They're small round beads. And I've seen the process that makes glass beads. It is the coolest thing I've ever seen. The glass gets taken and it's sorted and it's crushed down to a certain size, and it's put in this giant funnel that has this huge burner in it, and there's a vacuum that sucks the glass up, and as it does, it makes it round because it's heating up the glass, crushed glass. It makes a round bead out of it, and it comes out, and it's just a really, really cool process to see. It's a huge, huge process. But the benefits of glass beads are, since it's a bead, it's going to produce a brighter finish. So if you are taking a piece of material that you're trying to clean up but also trying to make it shiny, you use a glass bead. Glass beads produce a real nice finish. And not only that, the grit is like a 50, let me see, like 50 to 325. I have a hard time remember all this stuff. But the good thing about the glass beads are they can be recycled up to 30 times. Since it's a bead, it's not an angular sharp corner, it's a bead. And the bead is going to bounce off and you can recycle it. It's not going to break down as fast as crushed glass. So you use glass beads, it's almost like soda blasting when you're trying to do a finer surface. You want a nicer surface finish, a shinier part, and you're trying to do, maybe you have a part that has corners in it and you want to get a finer finish in there. That's what you use glass beads for. Very nice material to use, a little more expensive. The material that I buy, I get the crushed glass for 10 bucks. For that 50-pound bag. They'll also sell me glass beads for 10 pounds for a 50-pound bag. So it's the same price where I buy it, but it's not going to be that way when you go to buy it. So just decide if you want to use a glass bead or crushed glass. What are you trying to do? Glass bead, shiny finish. Crushed glass, a little rougher finish. Next, we have silicon carbide. And that's the kind of material that's used in sandpaper. This is also an angular type particle. The grits are roughly 16 to 240 grit. It's a fast cutting material like sandpaper. It's a fast cutting grit. This is something that has a blocky grain structure that splinters. So when you take the silicon carbide and you blast on something, it's going to splinter and it's going to break apart. So it breaks down. However, it can be used many, many, many times. So you can recycle it. It just gets to a finer and finer grit the more and more you use it. This is the kind of thing that's great for etching glass. So if you have glass, a glass part with maybe a stencil or something, you want to etch the glass, silicon carbide is a great material to use for that because it's going to etch that glass really fast. Next we have plastic abrasive, and it is exactly what it says. It's a plastic abrasive. It's a urea, different kinds of plastic they use to make this. This is also an angular type material. The grit size can be anywhere from 12 to 80, so it's pretty coarse. It's not a fine material. It's going to be coarser, and since it's coarse and larger, it's going to have a quick stripping rate. Whatever you're trying to strip off, it's going to strip it off quickly, and it's going to be consistent because it's plastic. Not only that, it's going to take paint off of aluminum and other softer metals, other delicate type metals, which makes it great for automotive parts, really fine automotive parts, and aerospace parts. This is the kind of material you're going to use for aluminum stripping paint off aluminum. You don't want to damage the aluminum. Very, very soft material, or a small aerospace application. That's what you use that for. Plastic abrasives, small parts, more delicate. Next we have pumice. Pumice is a natural light abrasive. This is something you use, it's less aggressive, and it's something you want to do when the surface protection is important. You want to protect something underneath, you don't want to damage it, you use pumice. This has a grit range of roughly 14 to roughly 325. Pumice is a natural material, so it's going to be less aggressive. It's very soft, it's a little softer, so it's not going to be as aggressive when you want to protect what you're blasting underneath. Next we have corn cob. And corn cob is also an angular type particle, and the great thing about corn cob is organic, right? Corn cob's natural organic. This is soft, and it's safe for delicate parts. If you have a delicate part, delicate surface you want to protect, you're going to want to use the corn cob. For wood, if you have some wood you're trying to blast some paint off, if you're trying to clean something like that, that's where it really helps out. It works really well on wood. It comes from in grits from extra coarse to extra fine, so you have to try and experiment with what works best for you and actually what will fit for your blaster. I use the walnut in my vibratory shaker to clean off parts, so you can use it in a vibratory shaker or in a blasting cabinet for blasting media if you're trying to protect The surface underneath, like I said, wood surfaces, that kind of thing. And corn cob, it's nice, biodegradable. You just throw it outside, throw it away. Next we have walnut shells. Now, walnut shells come from, as you guessed, walnuts. I use those also for my vibratory cleaner when I put parts in to vibrate clean them. But walnut shells are great in blasting for really aggressive, fast stripping. Even though it's a soft, it's a very durable material, and it's going to protect the substrate. If you have something you want to protect the substrate, let's say you have, like, say, fiberglass or something you want to protect underneath and you want to just blast off some paint, walnut shells is the kind of thing you want to use. You can use it for cleaning hardwoods, obviously auto applications, aerospace applications, and this is also an angular type product, or the particles are also angular, comes from extra coarse to extra fine. Again, you have to choose what works best for you. But again, another thing, walnut shells, they're organic and they're biodegradable. So once you're finished with it and you're finished recycling it, you don't have to worry about disposal or harming the environment. You can just put them out and put them in the ground and they just dissolve. They're biodegradable. Now the last thing we'll talk about are steel grit and steel shot. Steel grit is something you would use when you have a high demand, aggressive need, where you really have to clean something. This is something you're going to use on steel or other foundry metals when you're trying to clean them rapidly. It's softer than aluminum oxide. It's steel, but it's still softer than aluminum oxide, and it's not going to fracture. Unlike the other materials where it fractures and breaks apart, the steel obviously is not going to fracture and break apart. This makes it excellent for etching metal. So if you have like steel and you want to etch into the steel, this is something where you put a template on and you would etch something right into steel. And this stuff is pretty hard. It's an angular particle, so it's sharper, and the particle size is going to be like 12 to 80 grit. The other thing is about, since it's metal, it has a Rockwell hardness, and on the Rockwell C scale, it's about 40 to 65 Rockwell hardness. So it's a pretty hard material. And you're going to use this for very aggressive blasting. I've used it before to blast production parts. So you might have a giant blaster where you're putting this metal in and you're blasting a lot of parts at once, trying to clean them and make sure they're ready for some kind of surface preparation. I've never used them in a setting for a shop setting. But if you do have the need for a large blasting surface and you want to do it high demand, a lot of parts, steel grit is the thing you want to use. Now the last thing we're talking about is steel shot. And steel shot are small balls of steel. It's not an angular, it's a round ball. And the size of them are roughly 70 to 780 grit. You can get them very different sizes. They're made to different sizes. And they're also Rockwell hardened. These will have a Rockwell hardness of roughly 40, 50, 51. The shot peening, you're going to use it for cleaning, stripping, and not only cleaning and stripping, but it's going to improve the metal that you're working on. And you've heard of shot peening. What shot peening is, it's a process where it's a cold working process. You're cold working the surface of some steel, and it's going to produce a smooth, polished surface. And shot peening, it's when you have the blasting and you're blasting the shot, what it does is it hits the surface and it hardens that surface, and it produces a improved compressive strength of that material. So when you have steel or something that you're shot peening, whatever part you're taking, you want to prep the surface, it can relieve stresses in the material, but it's mostly designed to improve the compressive strength of the material that you're shot peening. It's a little more expensive, you need more pressure to do it, but shot peening is more of a process than it is a cleaning step that you're going to do in a shop. A little more expensive, the more you get into these steel grits and shot peening, steel shot, it's more expensive and obviously heavier, harder to throw around, you need more air, bigger equipment, but shot peening is something that's available for you to use. Okay, so those are the different kinds of media that are available to you when you are going to do some blasting in your shop. Again, if you're going to do this, I would caution you against using sand. You don't want to use sand and have that silica in the air and breathe it in your lungs. It's very dangerous, so just stick away from sand. I know it's cheap, but like I said, I buy glass, crushed glass or glass beads for $10 for 50 pounds. It's really not that expensive. And I hope that helps you out when you decide what you're going to use in your blaster, whichever size you choose. It all depends on, remember, what am I blasting? What's the substrate? What am I trying to get off? and what kind of surface finish do I want to produce when I'm finished. Do I want a rough surface finish for powder coating or a painting? Do I want a smooth surface for polishing, clear coating, whatever you're trying to do? So just remember that when you choose your media. Look it up. There's a million resources available. I recently went to Harbor Freight, and I'm just trying to give you a reference point, and they had walnut shells, corn cob, they had aluminum oxide, and they had some plastic. So you can get all that stuff at Harbor Freight. The other stuff is a little more specialty. You'll have to search and find that if you have that application. But for me, glass beads and crushed glass are good for 99% of the stuff that I blast in my shop. Car parts, rusted car parts, aluminum intake manifolds, aluminum parts, water pumps, anything you're going to work on your car. The blast cabinet I have and the crushed glass does almost everything I need. I hope that helps you out. Thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage.